We have two extraordinary biographers with us on the stage today, Robert Wainwright and Laura Thompson. I'm going to ask them each briefly about the subjects of their most recent books, and then we're going to get into a free-for-all to which you can contribute a bit later in the session. So listen, think of smart things to ask, and then join us a little later on this afternoon. But we're going to kick off with Robert. Robert Wainwright is a journalist. He has 8 books to his name on subjects as diverse as Lord Lucan and the subject that we're mainly going to be talking about today. And I thought I'd kick off, Robert, by asking you to tell us about Princess Dmitri Romanov, or Sheila Chisholm, as she was born.
Well, I was extremely lucky to find an Australian woman whose name was Sheila, I have to say. It might not have worked quite as well if her name was Mildred, I suppose, but her name, in fact, was Sheila. It was unearthed because a friend of mine had seen 2 sentences in the biography of the Queen Mother about this Australian woman who was banned by King George from seeing his second oldest son because she was Australian, and he didn't like that idea. And the friend of mine said, look, she seems very interesting, but I've never heard anything about her, Sheila Chisholm. Why don't you, I was doing nothing in London at the time, he said, why don't you go and have a look to see if there's anything in this woman? And I looked a little bit more closely and more emerged, and this woman had fallen through the cracks of history, as sometimes they do, from a woman who was one of the best known women in London in the 20s and the 30s and in France and even in the US, to being completely forgotten after the Second World War. She had an affair with the Queen's father before he was married, and she was pursued by Rudolph Valentino. She married the son of a lord, then an earl, and finished up marrying a Romanov Russian prince. And it all sounds as though it was about men and a woman chasing men, but in fact it was completely the opposite. And she was chaste, and she pushed most of them away, but she had this wonderful life of being an exotic, rebellious Australian in London who did many wonderful things, including running the biggest charity London ever seen. And so Sheila emerged as this glorious, independent, spirited country girl from Goulburn in New South Wales.
A formidable figure and well worth writing about. We're going to hear more about her in a tick. I mean, I like Sheila because her biography so closely matches my own, but there is a lot in there that you uncover, so I look forward to discussing that further. Laura Thompson is also the author of many books. She is the award-winning author of Life in a Cold Climate, a biography of Nancy Mitford. She wrote a biography of Agatha Christie in 2007 with the subtitle An English Mystery. She wrote the book on Lord Lucan. I should apologise. I attributed that to Robert before, but he wrote a book on Martin Bryant, a far less glamorous criminal figure. Both of you dabbled in a criminal past, but Laura, you couldn't resist the lure of the Mitfords. What was it?
It's a story that is unrepeatable. It could only have happened at the time that it did in the interwar years. These girls were born between 1904 and 1920, the 6 very glamorous girls, and it's an unrepeatable story. And although it's been told often enough, I was asked to write this book because the last one of them had died. Deborah, Duchess of Devonshire, died in 2014. And so my publisher said, oh, do a kind of, well, with an eye to the main chance, I suppose. But what interested me about it was trying to do an overview on the phenomenon of why, it's all, the story is so obviously fascinating. Unity Mitford became close to Hitler. Diana married Sir Oswald Mosley, who was the leader of the British Union of Fascists. Jessica married a communist and eloped with him to the Spanish Civil War. Nancy became a famous novelist. Deborah became the Duchess. And then there's the other one, Pam, the chicken breeder, who, was quite hard sometimes to weave into the story with the chicken breed. But
Hitler chickens, it's hard.
It was a challenge. But the story is so incredible that you almost lose sight of just how incredible it is. And you find yourself sort of writing. So then she went and had lunch with Hitler, and you think, no, hang on a minute. How did this happen? Where did this girl come from? What was the family dynamic that produced how they sparked off each other? And the parents as well, the influence of the parents who Nancy wrote about in The Pursuit of Love. But they were not quite like The Pursuit of Love. Nancy was, if you like, the architect of the Mitford myth. So you have this powerful myth, and then you sort of try and test the truth against it. So that was all really interesting. And just to try to understand why, although in some ways they were so ghastly, frankly, the power of their charm continues to exert this fascination. And particularly over a whole new sort of generation of young women in England, a kind of, they're writing blogs about, oh, let me be like Nancy and everything. And you think, oh, hang on, have you actually read some of her stuff? But, they have this imagistic fascination. And I wanted to explore that. And at the same time, tell the story kind of in context. So it isn't just like, we know how ghastly it is to have been friends with Hitler. Try and go back to 1932 and trace the journey. So that was the interest. But they had quite... There's a lot of contact with your subject as well, isn't there? So that's that was quite interesting to me to find that out.
That's where we find ourselves. 6 women with an indelible place on history and a kind of set of myths around them. One woman largely forgotten by history, but whose contact with it in the early 20th century was remarkable. And so we're joined by 2 extraordinary writers who bring those 7 women to life. I'm sorry, Robert, the weighting is not great. 7 women. You've managed one of them.
I'm happy with one. One's enough. 6 is very complicated.
That thing for a biographer about looking at their subjects with the benefit of hindsight, I might start with you, Laura, given that Take 6 Girls is written once all the Mitfords are gone. So you're thinking about the nature of their legacy and thinking about the ways in which it might need to be reclaimed or even redeemed. You met 2 of the Mitford sisters while they were still alive. Maybe to begin with, could you read that brief passage from early in Take 6 Girls,
sure,
which captures a bit the mad language of the Mitfords, and also a hint of your personal contact with them?
OK. The Mitfords inhabited a linguistic microclimate whose almost nursery way of speech, oh, do be sorry for me, is famous above all for the nicknames they gave to everybody, especially each other, which began as a private joke and were later displayed for public consumption. Again, people may have sometimes got things confused and thought that Woman was the Nazi and Honks the writer, or Stubby was the countrywoman and Bobo the Duchess. Nevertheless, there was an awareness that this was how the Mitfords went on. They all met Hitler and they all called him Hitty the house painter, or something like that. Some years before she died, I interviewed the then Duchess of Devonshire, or Debo, as she was always known. Although Nancy, have you heard this one? Called her 9 after her alleged mental age. She admitted to a brisk bafflement with the whole Mitford industry. As for people being, this is her, as for people being interested in us all now, I mean, it's just amazing. But they seem to be, for some reason best known to themselves. I mean, this is what she said, but she's so disingenuous. She knows perfectly well why everyone was interested. Her sister Diana Moseley, Honks, Bodley, Cord, Nardi, those are her nicknames, whom I also met, came more sharply to the point. Oh, the Mitford family has become a frightful bore, she said, laughing her still beautiful head off in a very Mitford way, almost silently, as if the mirth were too great for verbal expression. It bores us to death. Yeah.
You met Diana Moseley in the course of writing your book on Nancy, Life in a Cold Climate. How much did that weight of history, that pressure, that kind of prejudged knowledge of her, make that a difficult meeting to have?
That's so interesting. I was petrified. I mean, this was 2002. She lived in Paris. She lived in this gorgeous flat. This very airy flat in the 7th arrondissement. And I was petrified. And I went, and they said, oh, no, she's asleep. And I thought, OK. and I'd got these I'd bought her some white roses. I thought that was the thing to do. And so they sent me away. And I thought, oh, what do I do? So I went back the next day. And she opened the door, very tall, taller than I am. She was 92. She was still beautiful. I'm not just saying it. She had this Greek profile, quite lovely, very airy. And she did this gesture toward these white roses that I bought that had been put out in a vase. She did this gesture. It was just like a ballet dancer. And it was the most graceful, feminine thing I ever thought. And then I said to her, I've had a glass of champagne round the corner because I'm so nervous. She said, champagne puts one on the map. And it was... And from then on, that was how it was. She was so charming. She was warm, so warm to me. Completely deaf, but always with this sublime smile while I sort of shouted at her. And very interesting about Nancy. Nancy had denounced Diana during the war and was one of the, not instrumental in getting her sent to jail, but was helpful in getting her sent to jail. She hadn't found this out that long earlier, that long since. And so she was quite bitter in some ways toward Nancy, and some old boy came to tea and he said, Diana hated Nancy. But she didn't. It was more complicated than that. But of course, the whole time you're looking at her and thinking, you met Hitler. You know, there's this sense of the darkness and the sinister nature of Diana, who was a Nazi sympathizer, a fascist sympathizer. You can explain it to an extent. The family had Germanic sympathies, not to do with Nazis, but just Germanic. In 1932, when she met Mosley, Britain was in a terrible state. He was a politician that lots of people followed with his plans for unemployment and so on. And she fell for him. She fancied him. But she also fell for she was very politicized. And you can sort of trace it. But what I couldn't get over was her kindness and her warmth. And I couldn't equate it with the woman who had sat at Nuremberg. For a start, that her sense of humour hadn't kicked in. She hadn't just fallen about laughing at these idiots, but also the evil. So you sit there and you just try and work it out the whole time. And I imagine lots of people felt the same way. She was the most fascinating person I've ever met. And I think about her regularly. And I think she's one of the most enigmatic women probably who ever lived. And her unrepentant confidence. She was a woman in a million, and that doesn't necessarily mean in a good way, but I'm very, very, very glad to have met her.
Do you, either through talking to her or through your reading since for Take Six Girls, get to the bottom of what it was about Mosley? Was it just raw charisma? Because it wasn't just her that fell for him. I mean, they were all a bit besotted with him.
Well, it was good old sex, a lot of it. I mean, he was like a rock star, how he went around seducing everybody. He really, you know, could have had a list like Jagger or somebody. I mean, it was quite... I suppose, I don't mean to generalise, but perhaps the average English upper-class man, like the person that Diana married when she was only 18, they're perhaps not the most confident with women sometimes, the old public school, you know. And then along comes Mosley, sort of, you know, in all his black. I mean, utterly bloody ridiculous, but different and massively charismatic and sort of with all his fencing and all this nonsense. But, yeah, he cut a dash, there's no question. But she did, because she was a very good writer, Diana, and she did spend a lot of her writing, in a way, bigging up Mosley and justifying herself. And she did sort of say, in the 1930s, he was the man with the answers. And to be fair, she was not alone in thinking that. You know, there were other politicians who thought that his plan for unemployment made a lot of sense. Others thought, oh, hang on, this is a bit totalitarian here. But you know, hindsight is, as they say, a wonderful thing.
That question of hindsight for the biographer, Robert, what about with Sheila? She was an Australian. We often think of, in fact, I think it's a Christopher Koch line that Australia sits outside history, that we're somehow missing out on that grand European theatre of the early 20th century. Was Sheila, when she headed off overseas, politically aware? Do you get a sense that she was someone heading out into the world with a sense of her place in it, or was she there to play?
Well, Sheila was still a child, really, when she left. I think there was a great naivety. Most people, helped by Churchill, actually, didn't believe there'd be a great war. And so Sheila left Sydney with her mother to go on a grand tour, I suppose, which was common of that type of that day, although her mother was rather left-wing and was more interested in her daughter learning about culture in Europe. So they had grand plans to tour through Italy and France and London and Germany, and had to curtail that because of the war. So she found herself in London by accident, really, and then, in fact, they couldn't get back to Australia, so she and her mother went to Egypt to play a role as community nurses for the troops there. So it was, if she was naive, of course that changed rather quickly with the war. And her life took a turn by accident there when she went to visit her brother in a military hospital to be taken by the man who was in the bed next door, who made her laugh. She was being chased by every available man in the camp, as you might imagine. But in fact, the one person that she fell for wasn't particularly good looking, but he made her laugh and cared about her dog. And then her life became somewhat different, and she entered the world of the Mitfords and others.
I love the line that you quote from her mother about her mother's aspirations for her on that front.
It was about chaste but be chastened. Yes.
No, nice.
Yes, it was. Yes, her mother actually really was the cornerstone of her. Well, her mother and her father, actually. Her father introduced her to literature. I mean, this young woman literally grew up chasing kangaroos, learning how to skin snakes, shear sheep, and used to challenge the men. She had two brothers, and she grew up in Goulburn, which was very isolated now, let alone then. And so she was always doing things to beat the boys, like she once swallowed an entire bottle of Tabasco sauce, I think it was, to prove she could. And when she went swimming at Bondi, she and her best friend had to swim out further than any of the men until the day they were out beyond the breakers and saw a man being taken by a shark. So she went from that to this rather very, very different world of post-war London.
I mean, one of the extraordinary things reading your book is the way in which her life, you used the phrase, took a turn before. It keeps taking turn after turn. I mean, these improbable kind of collisions with history and with these major figures. Do you think that happened because she was an Australian girl? Like those qualities of Australianness were what made her so attractive to the people she was meeting?
That was an interesting theme because she was exotic to Europe, to London. I mean, London was filled with aristocrats marrying American heiresses because, of course, the great estates of the aristocracy were being torn apart and young men were having to find jobs. And so they were marrying into money, so they were swapping titles for money. And Sheila was one of a handful of Australians in London at the time. And in fact, when she was noticed by the media, and in fact, a lot of my research was contemporary media, which was very handy. She was not an Australian in London, she was the Australian in London. And she was an exotic creature. She was quite tall, and she was athletic, and clothes hung off her like a clothes horse. And so she was the land from the land of the golden wattle. And I think the notion of Australian being laughed at for being colonial hadn't really entered the fray at that time. Instead, that they were something to be admired because of their difference. And the line I particularly love is long after she became part of society, there was an English writer, and I'm sorry I have forgotten her name, but she watched Sheila descend, standing at the bottom of a staircase having a cigarette at a party. And a great lady descended the staircase in a beautiful gown, and she got to the bottom of the staircase and saw Sheila and said, "Sheila, what do you think of my gown?" And Sheila replied, "Well, it's lovely apart from the tarty bit of ribbon around your neck." And the writer, this was terribly important to the writer because it became part of her vernacular of life. She said there was only one woman in London who could have got away with that, and that was Sheila Chisholm. So she was very Australian in that context.
Laura, to what extent were the Mitfords a product of their age, and to what extent were they strangely kind of outsider?
Yes, it's so interesting the way Robert talks about Sheila, and you can imagine this exoticism. They had a toughness about them as well, the Mitfords. They weren't actually born. I mean, Nancy became the great offerer up of the upper classes, if you like. She wrote about them in a way that people, The Pursuit of Love was published in 1945 when that whole thing was beginning to disintegrate. She offered, and to be disapproved of, but she offered it up in a way that made it, fake accessible and popularised it. She was the great gatekeeper in that sense. But she wasn't. I mean, they only became honourables, which is the title that you get if you're the daughter of a lord, or a child of a lord. They only became that by default because their father only inherited because his brother was killed in the war, and so they weren't really typical aristocrats in that sense. They had too much of a kind of eye to publicity, too much. You know how the English aristocrat, they'd rather die than be vulgar. Oh, God, let me roll around in my new tweed jacket so nobody thinks it's new, God forbid, all that drivel. They didn't have any of that about them. They liked publicity. They liked being out there, and they weren't typical. They weren't typical. At the same time, they were brought up. They had chaperones and all that sort of thing. And that's the joke, that when they were brought up in the country, and again, the parallels with Sheila, they sort of rode to hounds and all that, they had a sort of tough, really rugged upbringing in some way, areas of toughness in them. And they were very resilient women. But they weren't typical, and although the joke of their parents sort of trying to keep a clamp on them so that when Diana went to Paris to finishing school, she wasn't allowed to walk from here to there without a chaperone. Oh, and then, hello, she's having lunch with Hitler. The way they eluded the parental control, Nancy wasn't allowed to smoke, and then hello, Unity's sort of shooting herself because war's been declared. The way they eluded parental control, but I think it was the family dynamic sparking off each other. When Jessica eloped and Nancy's then husband said, oh, he did it because he was in competition with you, Unity. You were the first to be in the papers. And Jessica didn't like it, and so she went and eloped. That's reductive, but there is a strong element of truth in it, I think.
It's very easy to judge other people's parenting decisions from outside, but just a tip, if anyone's got a baby on the way, calling it Unity Valkyrie is probably dooming her to a difficult life, I would have thought.
She was conceived in swastika.
Yeah, that's tricky.
That's insane in Canada when the father was prospecting for gold. And they went and lived out there, and she was conceived in swastika. If you put that in a novel, you'd be told to go and learn to grow up. And that, again, was the challenge of the book, is giving these events their proper context, so that, otherwise it just becomes... Hitler has the same sort of value as, whoever. I mean, it's the fact that Diana got married in Goebbels' drawing room. I mean, it is quite... He gave her a very nice wedding present as well.
Well, good. I'm glad he had an upside.
Yeah.
Good gift buyer. Note that down, people. Yeah. Watch out for the good gift buyers. Robert, Sheila fell in with a bad crowd of her very own. Can you tell us about the 4 do's?
A bad crowd? Well, I mean...
No, I'm only joking. They're lovely.
Well, I mean, it's part of the remarkable thing about life in this golden age, as we talk about it. I mean, the Mitfords are extraordinary. Sheila, with her singular life, was I just didn't know where it was going to go next. But the focus of most interest is the relationship with the two kings of England, I suppose, who both fell in love with this tall woman from Goulburn. Basically, David, who became King Edward, needed an excuse to be with his girlfriend Freda Dudley Ward, who was a married woman, and Edward seemed to like older women, or who would treat him that way. And it just so happened that Sheila was Freda's best friend in London at the time, so he paired him with his younger brother, who we know as Bertie. And so they met and were just basically to sit in the back seat of the roller while they went out away on picnics. And these two in the back seat fell for each other, or particularly Bertie fell for Sheila. And at the end of my research, I was lucky enough to get hold of Sheila's photo albums, which are rotting away in a bottom bookshelf in the family home in Berkshire. And here's these extraordinary photographs of this woman smoking sullenly between two kings of England, or sitting casually on a fence. These sorts of photographs just don't exist anywhere. But Bertie fell in love with Sheila and doted on her, and eventually Edward called them the Four Do's. And we can't really know for sure what it meant, except that George, who was a tyrant father, who told them what they couldn't do, I think the most likely explanation is that it's what they could do. We'll do what we want to. And in fact, they said that. We know that London is watching us. We know they think it's inappropriate, but goddamn, we're going to do it anyway. And that was pretty much what life was like in those days. Post the Great War, society of the day, they had survived this terrible 4 years, and they were going to party as much as they could.
As a journalist, you have to see a golden age when two royals could hang out with two married women, and that was just not the biggest scandal of the day.
Well, I don't think that... The truth is, I think that happened quite a lot. It just didn't happen officially. And of course, this is the time when the royal family changed its name. They allowed commoners and actors into the court. And in fact, it's not too long a bow to draw that if history was slightly different, and English crowds that I've talked to have sort of gasped at this, but we possibly could have had a Queen Sheila. Well, I'll tell you why, because nobody could have foresawn what Edward did. Bertie was the second son. He was in love with Sheila and wanted to stay with her. She could have divorced. She was one of the first women in London to divorce her husband, who was a lovable person, but he was a hopeless case, and he eventually committed suicide. And because the attention was off him, he could have quite easily married her, and by the time Edward stood down from the throne, that would have been a decade later, and they could have had a couple of kids, and she would have ascended the throne, which would have been quite lovely for my book, but it didn't happen, of course.
That was such a shock to me. I didn't know about this, about George VI and Sheila. I did, because he's portrayed in England as this kind of, like he only ever slept with one woman, i.e. the Queen Mother. I was riveted by that.
Well, there was a scene later on in the book where it was in a drawing room in Buckingham Palace, and Sheila was there, and the Queen Mother was there, because one of the great delights of this discovery was on the night that his father said, you have to renounce this woman and I'll make you the Duke of York. His father was having a birthday party, so he went to a dance and deliberately danced with Sheila one last time. And as they were twirling around the dance floor, they spied a young woman in a doorway, and it was the future Queen Mother. So he was dancing with Sheila the night that they met. So there's some lovely aspects in this story, quite extraordinary, really.
And there was also something, if I may, there was something I didn't know, which was that her first husband, who was Lord Loughborough, was the half-brother of somebody called Hamish Sinclair Erskine, who was Nancy Mitford's first love. The fact that he'd slept with her brother was a bit of a giveaway, but Nancy sort of ploughed on with it. Unbelievable. But Nancy was like, she was not... her sisters were incredibly good with men. I mean, I know that sounds insane when one of the men is Hitler, but but they did have this kind of... They were very feminine and very good-looking. Nancy, I think, she was very attractive, but she was almost too sharp. She never edited what she said. If it was deflating to a male ego, it wouldn't stop her. She couldn't resist a quip. But I never felt that she did get married to this guy, Peter Rod, and she did fall madly in love with a Frenchman. But I always felt she preferred the solitary life as a highly creative person. But that's something you never know about another person. But the myth about Nancy, though, she was so sad, she never had love, she never had children. I didn't feel that. She had plenty of opportunities, but I think something in her, the cleverness possibly, which in those days didn't necessarily go hand in hand with, the more conventional married life.
This point I'll raise there, actually, it's interesting, is that we keep talking about the women we've written about being beautiful, which they were.
Yeah.
But in fact, again, at this time, there was this notion of ugly beauty, which was the it girl. Rudyard Kipling had written about it. There was movies about it, there was books about it. And these women, the Mitfords and Sheila and others of their kind, were drawn out as great examples of this. And there really was a movement about you had to be more than simply beautiful. You had to have charisma, you had to have intelligence, you had to have a presence about you to be noticed. And that's what these women had. They had in common.
Yeah.
It was an extraordinary time with extraordinary people. And even though women's rights weren't around, they were starting to sort of stamp themselves on society and on intellectually. And it really was an important time.
Robert, that brings me to something I'm really curious about in the case of telling Sheila's story, which is that so many of the sources that you're able to find are about the way she's observed from outside, the way she's seen. Were you able to find Sheila's voice much in the process of putting it together?
Some. It was a very unusual exercise for me. I love research, but Sheila was a treasure hunt which was of shards, tiny piece of information which I had to try to piece together and try to draw some lines between. And Sheila, despite her great beauty and confidence, wasn't self-assured inside. She was trapped in marriage that she wasn't sure of. She was constantly seeking the love of her life. As you'd imagine, her family is on the other side of the world. So the night of her greatest triumph, which was organising a charity ball in London, which I think 2,000 people went to, her father died. So there was this great sadness in this great beauty. And she wrote very little. And apart from that, very strangely also, when you do biographies, is you find when you walk into somebody else's life, you have to convince their family that you had a right to be there. Why would they tell me? Her grandson is the current Earl of Rosslyn. Most people know Rosslyn through the Da Vinci Code. It's the chapel outside Edinburgh where it ends. And this place actually exists, and this family is one of the most senior aristocracies in the United Kingdom. And in fact, he, at the moment, is the head of Clarence House. And so when I first wrote to him, he politely refused through his third secretary. And when I wrote to him again, he politely refused through his fifth secretary. And when I wrote to him again, he ignored me. And it was only, strangely, I was having dinner with a friend in London, and her friend piped up and said, "Peter Rosslyn, I know Peter Rosslyn, I went to Eton with him. I'll get him to call you." And for once in my life, the old school tie worked perfectly. And I didn't have a school tie, but he did. And 2 hours later, he returned my email. So I actually only discovered her voice through her memoirs after I'd written the first draft. And so then I went back and poured Sheila into the story that I'd discovered myself.
God,
Laura, you must have had almost the opposite problem, which is that, as you've indicated, there was something so kind of performative about the Mitfords and so much telling and retelling of their own story that it must have been a challenge to not let their voice dominate, if that makes any sense.
Yes, that's really true. You just have to keep clearing your mind. It's like, you mentioned I did Agatha Christie, and it's not the same because she didn't have a dominant voice like that, but the sheer fame of the woman sometimes would sort of reduce you to a wreck. You'd think, oh, Christ, I can't write, you know, the whole world knows this woman. And the Mitfords, slightly different, but you know, that little reading I did when I talked about their voice, that dominant voice, as you say. And the worst thing would have been to stray into some sort of ghastly imitation of that, or to catch it in some way and sort of... So I was very obdurate about never using their bloody nicknames or anything like that. It always had to be Diana and Jessica and... but it was taking it back to the family dynamic. That was the parents. I became almost most interested in their mother, Sydney Redesdale, she was the only member of the family who I don't think had that sort of rather fatal charm about her. I don't think she had any charm at all. And she was so admirable, the strength of the woman. You know, she spent the war, I mean, perforce, but she spent the war going between visiting Diana in Holloway and taking her a mink coat for warmth or something, because she was in some terrible cell for 3 years, and then going home to Unity, who had shot herself and was effectively brain damaged because she shot herself the day that war was declared. Utterly sincere in her love for both England and Germany. I mean, you know, however nuts she was sincere in her beliefs. But so the mother really became a very, very important person for me. And then the father, who did have the charm and had that idiom, that ease of idiom, you know, he'd sort of, if someone wrote, someone like Shakespeare, he'd have said, oh, well, he's a literary cove or something. You know, he had this kind of way of talking, this very demotic, appealing way of talking that Nancy used massively to effect. I mean, Nancy plundered them all, you know. But I became very interested in the parents and also in the brother, Tom, who was a more apparently absent figure, but he was the only one in the family that everybody liked. And he was I think the sisters tried to impress him as well. And he was an intellectual, and Diana was an intellectual, really. Diana should have been an intellectual. She was, you know, you can say what would have happened if they'd lived now. In some ways, I think they'd have been more circumscribed. They had a different kind of freedom from the freedom of women now. But they were characterised by not caring what anybody thinks about them, which is not a modern characteristic. But they simply, unlike Sheila, they were, I think, confident through and through. However balmy the things they did, they were completely confident in their own choices.
The exception to that, though, it seems to me, reading your book, maybe not an exception to that confidence, but one of the things that comes through very pervasively is how competitive they were with each other, how much they cared about how they were measuring up to one another and how they were being perceived by one another.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, the letters between them, which are completely unbelievably fascinating, and every nuance of, oh, I think Nancy, you know, and oh, you know, all the little sort of digs at each other and everything. The only two who never dug at each other were Diana and Deborah. They were completely happy with each other, completely fond. It's funny. And the only two who ended up never reconciling were Diana and Jessica, because Jessica blamed Diana for the war. But and they all sort of they all sort of disliked Nancy in a weird way, whether they felt she had made use of them for the novels, or whether they felt jealous of her amazing success, or whether... Jessica said something quite funny about her. She said, oh, I saw Nancy on the television, large as life and twice as unnatural. I think that was sort of how they saw her as... But I don't think they quite got her because of her being a writer and how that made her different in that respect. But yes, the way they sparked off each other right until the end, quite poignant in some ways. They sort of reverted to girlhood with every letter they wrote. But they were brave women. They were I liked their philosophy of life, which is Voltaire's, which is, I've decided to be happy because it's better for my health. And I think that was, they had a sunlit aspect to them, which sounds perverse when they were also so attracted to darkness. They had a coldness about them, a line of steel, I think one of their friends said. Absolutely true. But they had the merrymaking aspect of them, quite a kind of profundity for me. That it is, if you can make a joke, if you can see life in a happy context, which Diana was doing even in Holloway jail. It did sort of influence me in some ways. I didn't find them superficial. I found them impressive in many ways, with misgivings.
Important disclaimer.
Yeah.
Robert, given what you say about finding the shards of Sheila and piecing her together, was there a moment when your attitude to her changed, where you felt more protective of her as a biographer, where you felt more enamoured with her?
It's interesting. I remember I once spoke to one of the publishers. I never knew I had a book until well into the project, because it's simply you were trying to create something from nothing. And I said to him, I just want to find something worthy. And I was trying to find something beyond the superficial. And it wasn't that she was superficial, it's just her life sounded superficial, even though it wasn't. And he said, well, don't worry. He said, that's not the point. You're writing about a life. And if there is something there, there is something there. Having said that, I found, I think when I really admired her was when she had to reconstruct her life. And the other side of the Second World War, she was famous everywhere. I mean, the Kennedys, as I said, Rudolph Valentino, I mean, these were family friends across a great broad spectrum of life in London, from Churchill, politicians, through to entertainers, Noel Coward, Evelyn Waugh, through to the aristocracy, the royal family, etc., etc. She seemed to have a great broad brush, but she lost all that when her second husband died. He was a baron. Buffles, he was called. They all had great nicknames, just like the Mitfords. And she was sailing back from New York, and she was 52 and decided, well, what am I going to do with life? You know, I mean, I'm too old to really find another partner, although she did. And so she turned her address book to become one of London's first businesswomen. And she turned that into a travel agency. So she started with 2 people and established it at Fortnum and Mason. And within a few years, with no business acumen at all, she had established, and insisting that women are on the board, mind you, she had established one of the biggest independent travel agents in Europe. And I think that was the moment in which I really admired this woman, because life, which was fabulous, it was full of sadness as well. On one of her birthdays, her second son died. He was one of the first people to die in the Second World War, and she thought her husband was calling her to say happy birthday, and she was helping to deliver a baby in a community hospital outside London, only to call back and find that her son had died. So that's the one thing about this time of life. But she had turned it into something which was fabulous as being an independent businesswoman.
Why do you think she insisted on women being on the boards? Do you think she was consciously an advocate for women?
I think her mother really was a core of her life in that sense. But I think that I think her comment was that they were smarter and were more complex, and she saw good women as being able to do things, unlike men who simply were. And I personally, I think she was right, actually.
There's a chance for you to ask questions of our 2 extraordinary guests this afternoon. As you may already know, there is a microphone in the central aisle here. You need to make your way to it. It will not come to you. But do come and ask a question. We'd love to hear from you. And yes, don't be shy. It's also worth noting, if you do, this session is being streamed out to libraries across South Australia. So you can send a vaguely defamatory message to people in libraries everywhere, which is, if that's not tempting, I don't know what is. There's a question over here.
Is this on? In her autobiography, Nancy Mitford never tells us the name of the Frenchman with whom she was in love for so many years. I think she always referred to him as the Colonel. Do you know who it was?
Yes, this lady's asking about Nancy Mitford's, the love of Nancy's life, the Frenchman. He was a very interesting man. She always called him the Colonel because everyone had to have a nickname. He was Gaston Palevsky, who was the kind of right-hand man of General de Gaulle during the Second World War. When the Free French came over to London, de Gaulle brought... Because de Gaulle didn't have many... His social manner left a little to be desired. So Palevsky, who had a lot of charm, sort of eased the way for him. He was also a terrible womanizer, Gaston Palevsky. And he met Nancy, who was doing war work. When did they meet? 1942, I think? Yes. And they started an affair. She was still married to Peter Prod, who was a nightmare and haunted her all her life, actually, or wanted money, basically. But she fell for Palevsky. And after the war, when she went to Paris, she lived in Paris from sort of 1945 onwards, and having written The Pursuit of Love, was suddenly very rich. She said, I sat under a shower of gold. And it kind of liberated her, Paris, no question. It liberated her to sell, to be the person that she was almost too constrained by her own Englishness in London, I think. But the conventional wisdom is that she went to Paris because of Gaston Palevsky. But I kind of felt she wanted to go to Paris. The fact that if he'd been Norwegian, I think she'd have been less keen on him.
You make that case beautifully in Life in a Cold Climate. You put forward at least the possibility of the idea that she was as much in love with France as she was with the Frenchman.
But Diana was very funny about that, because I said to her, do you think that really Nancy really wanted to be an independent woman? Do you think she really wanted to marry Palevsky? And she said, I think she would have liked to have been asked.
Oh, God, imagine the pressure of being one of those sisters. Or worse still, the brother.
Yeah.
You'd be done for.
I'm just wondering, there were 7 children in the family, I believe.
Yeah.
How many children did those 7 have?
Oh, good Lord, sir. That's a very good question. Diana had 4, Deborah had 3, Jessica had 3. She had 2 children who died, actually, Jessica, which she sort of buttoned up and zipped up and just put the photos away, and that was her way of dealing with it. Tom, the brother, was killed in the war, so the family name went to brothers and what have you, the title. Pamela, like Nancy, had gynecological problems and couldn't have them. And so what is that? Is that
10.
Thank you.
Yeah,
I think that's right.
Give or take.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I think the important thing is that 2 of the women out of 6 were infertile.
Yes.
And that's average for the British community at that time of infertility.
Is it that's average, you say?
Yeah, that's probably due to gonorrhea.
Well, that's very interesting.
Have you got another question, sir?
Yeah. You never know when a gonorrhea expert's going to take to the mic. It's always the way. There's one in any crowd. In fact, he asked a question of Lucy Cousins about the Maisie books before, and gonorrhea in the Maisie books. It was quite surprising. Madam, we'll move to you.
Hello, my question is, did the Mitfords ever do anything for the community?
Oh, that's a very good question. Nancy did. She worked like a demon during the war, fire watching and taking in refugees. She loved, sorry if this is off colour, but things to do with the Mitfords are off colour. They had a huge house in London. She loved filling it up with Polish Jews because she thought it would upset her sisters so much. They're very, there's a terrible sort of darkness to them all. And it's always the personal and the political, and you can never quite decide whether Nancy was so anti-German just to annoy Diana. But I think it was genuine also. I mean, it was. But so Nancy did. Jessica was a wonderful... She was a civil rights campaigner. She was, when she went to live in America, she married this American lawyer, left-wing sort of human rights type lawyer, and they were wonderful people. Pamela... Chicken breeding, not so much. And then you have Diana and Unity. And the Duchess of Devonshire, Deborah, I mean, she did one... I mean, you might think, oh, that's a bit superficial, but she kept Chatsworth House. She saved Chatsworth House, which is a wonderful 18th century... no, it's 17th century, isn't it? Sorry. One of England's great stately homes, and she has turned that into an extraordinary attraction. And, you know, that's the keeping that going and keeping that as a viable business concern and what have you is quite an achievement. So they weren't complete sort of superficial, you know, twits. They were briefly bright young things and then sort of moved on, I think.
It is interesting, though. Both of your subjects are kind of privilege in the extreme, and extreme privilege, aristocracy. How did that feel to write those stories? The name of this session is Golden Age, and in part, I think that's a nod to a kind of bygone era of this kind of class stuff. Robert, was it I mean, looking at your books before this, I understand that your friend suggested this topic to you because of your love of archives and a mystery and everything else, but as far as the subject goes, it feels like a bit of a departure.
Oh, I mean, I like people behind stories, and it's a completely... It's age, but it's part of society is completely different from me as well. But that's part of its charm. I mean, Sheila could have only lived the life she was given. Not everybody can be a suffragette or a worthy part of life. It's part of what I thought about myself as I wrote about her. But Sheila's life, there were parts of it and parts of her sense that were important. I mean, she did strive. There wasn't a national health system in Britain before the war. The only way it was maintained, hospitals were maintained, was through society actually raising funds. It might seem trite, but it's not. And it was actually... Sheila actually ran London's biggest charity ball for 13 years. It was the only way the biggest hospital in London could be funded and kept its beds open. And in fact, its biggest event of the year was hers. She, as I said, I think played a very important role in terms of women in London, in terms of being in business. There's aspects of her life that I admire greatly. So I could see those parts of it. I also despaired with her, and I thought to myself, if you take away the glamour and the glitz of this woman's life, you have the life of a very ordinary woman. She had marriage problems, she despaired about her children and education, she had death in her family, she lived through 2 wars and a depression. I mean, it was extraordinary times, not just for its glamour, but for its heartache and despair as well. And to emerge the other side as an independent person who is admired, I think that's a big point, and always intrinsically Australian too.
I was going to say, you open the book with a description of her being interviewed with her third husband, who's a Romanov nephew, which just another great piece of history. She
ended life as a Russian princess. Yeah, that's right.
A Russian princess, but a Russian princess who, from what I could tell, couldn't stop talking about going back to Bondi and surfing.
Yeah, she came back here as a 68-year-old woman, her last trip back, and all she wanted to do was go to Bondi, and it all harks back. I mean, her memoir, which I got at the end of the process, which is fabulous at the beginning and peters away a lot at the end, she wrote quite beautifully and wrote lovingly of this Australian childhood. That's what she remembered. That's what really made her, whether it was lying in the orchard in Goulburn, making up plays, or swimming at Bondi. It was actually the core of her being, I suppose.
Laura, as a biographer, one of the gaps in my reading which makes me very sad is I've never read Nancy's biography of Madame Pompadour. Is it good?
It's fantastic. She's got... That was why I wanted to write about her in the first place, because I think as a writer, she's so familiar that she's almost undervalued, I think. I think when you consider this is a self-educated woman, more or less. She went to school for about a term or something. The only one who went to school was Unity, so conventional means of upbringing don't necessarily work. But you know, Nancy was self-educated. Diana was. They were clever. They were clever. That's important, I think. And she had this marvellous voice. Once she liberated her voice, Nancy, this wonderful, calm, benevolent, sharp, benevolent but very sharp, and cynical, I think, particularly about relations between the sexes. But she transported that voice to historical biography without a blink of an eye. Madame de Pompadour, somebody did say, it sounds rather like a story being told down the telephone by an enchantingly clever woman, which is kind of, it's got that chatty sort of, I don't think that was meant as a compliment. I think that was some snobby historian sort of who didn't approve of, she got quite a lot of that, quite a lot of misogyny, just for the sharpness of her. But her nephew, who was marvellous, said to me, it's the only time I've ever understood the 7 Years' War, when Nancy wrote about it. She could get to the heart of things and just lay them out for you, almost like an incredibly clever child. And her last book, this is when she was dying of cancer. She was in pain, like her sister Deborah said to me, she just used to sit up in bed and cry with the pain. She was in this pain for 4 years. They never diagnosed what she had properly. And she wrote a biography of Frederick the Great, for Christ's sake. She went round battlefields, Potsdam, all while she was in this terrible pain, and wrote this book. It's not her best book, it's not her most popular book, but to have gone from that self-educated girl, this bright young thing, to this woman in this intolerable pain writing about Frederick the Great, I found that an extraordinary journey.
Both these writers have written books with extraordinary journeys within about some extraordinary women. They're available in the bookshop. You should go and buy multiple copies. In each one, a different thing happens to the Mitford. So you've really got to get as many as you can. But I'd ask you to join me in thanking Laura Thompson and Robert Wainwright.